Hello. Today my guest is Dr. Radha Karmi, who is a Palestinian, has written her memoirs, has written a great deal on Palestine, and is in great demand as a Palestinian expert to speak all over the world. Radha Karmi's 3 books are In Search of Fatima, a very moving memoir of how she moved to London from Jerusalem with her family in 1948. Married to Another Man, Israel's Dilemma in Palestine is the second book, and her latest book is Return, a memoir. Radha, welcome. Very good to have you on our show. Hello. Tell me, when you wrote your first book, In Search of Fatima, what impelled you to do that?
Well, you know, I'd been a Palestinian activist for decades, and I couldn't help noticing that all those demonstrations and pickets and writings and appearances on television didn't improve the situation for Palestine. It was getting worse and worse. So I stopped for a moment. I thought, something's wrong. What is wrong with what we're doing? And then I remembered the sort of nearly parallel experience of the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is known by everybody. Every school child in England knows about the Holocaust. So I thought, well, how is that? They didn't get to know it because somebody wrote a history book, because they read United Nations resolutions, because they read refugee statistics. No, they knew it because the story had been told through the medium of narrative, through literature, through art, through plays, through poetry, through memoirs. And I thought, why don't we do the same? We have a story to tell. Why don't we tell it, but in a narrative form, in a personal form? So that was why I wrote In Search of Fatima.
And one of the amusing things in that book, amongst many others, and sad things too, I remember, was that when your father left Jerusalem with you and your mother, the area in London you settled down in was Golders Green, which was then, in the 40s and 50s, the largest Jewish suburb in London. And how did you find that?
That was one of the really ironies, and quite funny, really, in a very tragic story. We settled in, as you say, in a highly Jewish area, full of German Jewish refugees at the time. Well, it's quite interesting to tell you that as the only Palestinian family in that area, we got on quite well. And so I was accepted as a foreign girl. They liked me. And in fact, my best friend's mother said to me one day when I was thinking about marrying an Englishman, she said, "No, my dear, marry one of your own." She said, if you were Jewish, I'd find you a nice Jewish boy.
So, rather, that memoir, when it was published, had a huge impact. I remember it well. And I think one reason is, as you say, that people had not read a powerful Palestinian memoir to explain the Palestinian dilemma. Of course, it was not like the Holocaust, but it was still pretty bad. And very few people knew that story. But since then, you've been around the world speaking. And Married to Another Man, this book I've got in front of me, is a very, very powerful book, actually. And explain the title, Married to Another Man.
Yes, I know it's strange. And I have to tell you, it has led to quite a few misunderstandings. People thought it was about marital infidelity.
Naturally.
Exactly. And about loose women who were married to several men, that kind of thing. No, the title, in fact, refers to a story about 2 rabbis at the end of the 19th century And what had happened was that the World Zionist Congress had taken place in 1897. And a decision was made at that Congress that there had to be a state for the Jews, number one, and number two, that state had to be in Palestine. Now, the people who made that decision were European Jews. They didn't know anything really about the Middle East, and certainly nothing about Palestine. So they sent these two rabbis and asked them to report on what they saw. You know, what is this Palestine? What does it look like, etc. The rabbis went, and they found that the country was full of people like my ancestors, Palestinians, crowded, in fact. So they wrote back the following cable to Vienna. They said, "The bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man."
It's quite sweet in a way, actually.
Yes, yes. So, you know, the country is full, it's beautiful, but it's full of people, and it's already belongs to other people.
And this was also to sort of counter a view later held by Jabotinsky and others, which suggested that this, which Golda Meir used to use a lot, that this is a land without people for a people without a land, which was false always, and a deliberate lie.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Rather, but the other thing you say is very interesting, because you explain in this book how in the early days after the formation of the Israeli state in 1948, and the decade that followed, the Israeli leaders, however many wars they fought in and whatever else they did, were at least honest enough to know what they were doing and didn't try and deny it. And just for our viewers, I would like to read out a quote from General Moshe Dayan, the great general of the victory of 1956, when Britain, France, and Israel colluded to try and defeat a nationalist government of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. Speaking in 1956, you write, at the funeral of a young Israeli killed by an Arab infiltrator, in inverted commas, near the Egyptian frontier, Moshe Dayan said, "Let us not today fling accusations at the murderers. Who are we that we should argue against their hatred? For 8 years now, they sit in their refugee camps in Gaza, and before their very eyes, we turn into our homestead the land and the villages in which they and their forefathers have lived. We are a generation of settlers, and without the steel helmet and the cannon, we cannot plant a tree and build a home. Let us not shrink back when we see the hatred fermenting and filling the lives of hundreds of thousands of Arabs who sit all around us. Let us not avert our gaze so that our hand shall not slip. This is the fate of our generation, the choice of our life, to be prepared and armed, strong and tough, or otherwise the sword will slip from our fist and our life will be snuffed out." Now this is very honest, saying, we have taken their land, we will kill them if they try and take it back from us, have no doubt about that, but at the same time understand why they are angry. If you compare this to Israeli politicians over the last 20, 25, 30 years, with all the nonsense they talk, as if Israel is not responsible for anything, the contrast is quite remarkable. And rather, this sort of isn't, it wasn't just Moshe Dayan. I mean, Ben-Gurion said similar things as well. That first generation of Zionists was very hard, knew what they had done, untroubled by it, but prepared to admit that it went far.
Exactly. And you know, they were the true heirs of Vladimir Jabotinsky, who wrote a very striking essay in 1923, I think, called the Iron Wall. And in that he said, with, as you say, startling honesty, he said, let's face it, we will be here and can only be here by force of arms. He then went on to say, we have to accept that no people in the world will be ready to accept its land being taken by settlers and will continue to be our enemies forever. So then he goes on to say, if we are prepared for such a thing, we have to build around us an iron wall. Of course, what he meant by that was steel bayonets, which was, of course, the weapons of the time. An iron wall, and we must be prepared to do that forever. And then he says, and this is very striking, if we are not prepared to do that, then we must give up Zionism. It's fantastic.
And that is exactly what they have been doing.
Yeah, yeah.
And Jabotinsky, of course, at that point and later was criticized by so-called left Zionists from a socialist background who said this is, you know, what he is proposing is not what our plan is. We want to live in peace with the people there, etc., etc. So there were many other debates going on within the Jewish diaspora at the time, but Jabotinsky won out. I think one has to just admit this and move on. Rather, if we look back now, you know, it's nearly 100 years. In 2 years' time, it'll be the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. So, without the support of the British Empire, it would not have been possible to build the state. And in my opinion, even with the help of the British Empire, they might not have succeeded had it not been for the Holocaust, the Judeocide. It was the combination of the two that did the trick, because had there been no Judeocide during the Second World War and between 5 and 6 million Jews killed, there would not have been the desire on the part of Europe's Jews to go there.
Absolutely right.
So it is largely due to the foundation to the British Empire and the continuation to the German Empire under fascist domination. This is what happened. Europe is responsible for what has happened in the Middle East, and I don't think we can get away from the fact. But just leaving that aside for the moment, we have now seen huge Israeli victories, which have been, in some cases, of a decisive sort. I mean, 48, okay. They held on, the Arab armies were misled, led by rogues who had no desire to fight. The 67 war, I think, was the decisive war. Because two things happened. One, they defeated Arab nationalism, the pride of Arab nationalism. The Egyptian and Syrian regimes crumbled, and their armies crumbled before them. And secondly, the capacity of Israel to do this made them essential for the United States of America.
The Americans focused on Israel as a kind of local client for them, and a willing client who would be a counterbalance to several Arab states which had strong relations with the Soviet Union, like Egypt, like Syria, and the Soviet Union had armed them, had trained their people, had given them quite a lot of things, and the United States didn't want that. Now, Israel, therefore, was seen as something that was working for the United States in that sense. And hence they believed that by making it stronger, by giving it superior arms, by maintaining its strategic edge and its military edge over the Arabs, that this would be the way to go forward in their dealings with the Soviet Union. But what fascinates me is now there is no Soviet Union anymore. So the question arises, why this, as you put it, fanatical support for Israel, the diplomatic protection, the arming, the sharing of intelligence, the financial, the subventions that are made to Israel. What is that about? Israel couldn't get away with what it does unless it's allowed to. It's very simple. And who's allowing it to? The US in the first place, and of course Europe behind the US. Why is that? So why can Israel be supported, right or wrong, whatever it does? So this, I think, is a really important question. Why is that? Why is that? And I argued, I've had this argument with Noam Chomsky, and I asked him, why is it that America supports Israel to the hilt? What's that about? Isn't it about the lobby, really, the Israel lobby, which has somehow taken control of the political process in America? And he said, no. He said that lobby would be powerless. And if the imperialist power, that is the United States, did not think it useful in its global designs, not just in the area, and he assured me that it would drop Israel like a hot potato, as they say, if it was no longer acting this role. But I tell you, it didn't explain, much as I respect him, it didn't explain why so much support.
Well, I think you're right, but I think in a strange way Noam is right. Obviously, if the United States, let's say, wanted to take or dismantle country X in the Middle East, and for some strange reason the Israelis didn't play ball and intervene on the other side, the Americans would then move in, probably, and crush them. But it would have to be in extremis, something like that to happen. But the question you posed to Noam Chomsky, that why are they like that now, is, in my opinion, unanswerable without understanding the way in which US and Israeli politics have become imbricated, close to each other. And a journalist, I think, writing for the New York Review of Books, Michael Massing, if I remember his name correct, once did a survey in which he just gave a list of all the Republicans and Democrats on the payroll of the Israelis. If that is the case, rather, then the question arises, the Palestinians, the Palestinian Arabs, non-Palestinian Arabs are not short of a buck or two. I mean, why haven't they put in bids to buy 50 congressmen and about 10 or 12 senators? They could easily do it. Why don't they do it? Unimaginative or what?
No. It's a question we've asked ourselves many times as fellow Arabs. I'm afraid the answer is that the governments of the wealthy Arab states, which are the ones in a position, actually, to do what you suggest, those governments, those heads of state, are not independent of the United States. That, of course, is the problem. This is a problem, of course, well known in Latin America, where in the past, fortunately, but some still at the present time, were working for the US against the interests of their own people.
Oh, still, Mexico, Colombia, for instance.
Absolutely. Although, of course, recently, and it's very welcome, a number of states have freed themselves from this bondage. Our problem in the Arab world is that we have states which wield a lot of influence because of their great wealth, who are committed to serving the United States. It's shocking, but it's true. So they don't have the Arab cause at heart. They don't have the Palestinian cause at heart. Their chief preoccupation is staying in power, and fighting their own people in case they rise up in some kind of desire for liberation from this regime. And it's not surprising, therefore, that very little is done. And the only thing that's done, because there are activists in the United States, we have to face it, and Palestinians are very active and so on, but they have very few resources. You can't match the Zionists in this game. And, you know, it's our tragedy that we have these client states.
The first phase, after the formation of Israel, was a totally absurd attempt by the Arab leaderships with their pathetic armies, supervised by the British in some cases, to try and move this back. They failed. Second attempt was an offensive by the Israelis in league with France and Britain in 1956 to topple Nasser, and they came close to it. Had the Americans not pushed them back, they might have succeeded. Then came the 67 war. And after the 67 war, the Palestinian nation decided, we're not going to depend on these people anymore. We fight on our own. The Palestine Liberation Organization moved upwards. Other groups, the PFLP, other radical secular groups were formed later, much, much later. Hamas came into being. So there was a big shift against total dependence on the Arab states. This phase, in my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, came to an end with the Oslo Accords. When the PLO, not Hamas, decided that this was it, they more or less gave it up. The late Edward Said, our friend, referred to the Palestinian Accords as the Versailles Treaty of the Palestinian movement, was very angry, was denounced, and he was proved right. And since the Oslo Accords, it's been getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And we're now at a situation where the notion of a sovereign Palestinian state, independent of Israel, and independent in every sense of the word, seems a utopian pipe dream. So where do we go now?
Let me just make one comment about what you said. The surrender, as we would call it, started actually in 1988 when the PLO held, when the Palestine National Congress held a meeting in Algiers in which it declared that the Palestinians would henceforth fight for a Palestinian state on 22% of the original land of Palestine, the so-called two-state solution, and Israel would have 78%. And that really was the beginning of the decline. And you know, often, and I've been very generous in saying this, one understands why they did this, because Israel's too strong. They realized, they thought that they couldn't topple it. So why not settle for something perhaps attainable? So it was that kind of pragmatic thinking that did that. But of course, it's that thinking that set the stage for the Oslo Accords. Absolutely, and you're quite right. Things have become worse and worse and worse.
And the Israelis, I mean, they knew what they wanted from the Accords, but they put up a pretense that things were going to get better, they were going to do A, B, and C, the settlers wouldn't be allowed to settle here, etc. And they were forced to do that by the success of the First Intifada. And I've always wondered, rather, had the Israelis, which they didn't want to, but had they negotiated with the leadership of that Intifada instead of the guys in Tunis, who knows where we might have been.
Yes, it's true, But you know, there's a fundamental problem with all this. As I've explained actually in that book, Married to Another Man, and I've taken pains to explain that the aim of a two-state solution is wrong. It's wrong even if it had been possible. It's wrong from the point of view of principle and from the point of view of something that we haven't talked about, which is the right of return of the Palestinian refugees. 6.5 million refugees in camps for 67 years without any prospect of a solution, certainly no prospect of returning to their homeland. Now, what about these people? A two-state solution would have made it impossible ever for them to return. So, therefore, from my point of view, the leaders of the First Intifada, yes, they might have got more out of the Israelis than, in fact, what has happened. They might have got more concessions, more freedom to do certain things, but it would always have been in the context of separation, that the Israelis didn't want the Palestinians to come across to live in what was called Israel proper. They might be in enclaves, whatever. Because, as I say, that's a fundamental problem. And you know what we've got, this is what fascinates me. I argued in that book for the one state. I've always believed that, because in a one state, which we share with the Israeli Jews who are already there, the right of return becomes valid. Not only, it becomes doable, because the refugees would then be allowed to come back in a one state. But I have to tell you, at the time when I wrote it, there was a big argument. People said to me, no, this is unrealistic, it's not attainable, etc. But the irony is, it's with us. There is one state now.
There is, effectively.
Absolutely.
And also, rather, the latest decision by the Palestinians living inside Israel proper, so to speak, who united and put one slate and are now represented in Parliament and have got more representation, whether they're even conscious of it or not, and some of them must be. I mean, this is effectively, I think, a move towards a single state, whether the Israelis like it or not. Now, I'd like to quote another writer to you from your own book, Benny Morris, who was initially meant to be a liberal Zionist, but then became very hardline again. And he says that the mistake the Zionists made was to allow any Palestinians to remain in Israel, that there should have been a total political cleansing of the whole land of Israel. And he writes, if the end of the story turns out to be a gloomy one for the Jews, it will be because Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, did not complete the transfer in 1948. That means the expulsions, because he left a large and volatile demographic reserve in the West Bank and Gaza and within Israel itself. In other circumstances, apocalyptic ones, which are liable to be realized in 5 or 10 years, I can see expulsions. If we find ourselves in a situation of warfare, acts of expulsion will be entirely reasonable. They may even be essential. Now, this is one of their so-called liberal historians saying that to the Palestinians, hang on a minute, if you carry on with your intifadas, we might get rid of all of you. And this is not an idle threat. I mean, effectively, they're doing it with the settlements and what they're doing in East Jerusalem. But rather, what do you think? I know it's a difficult question, but answer briefly because we're running out. What do you think that part of the world, Israel-Palestine, will look like in 10 or 20 years?
What a difficult question. I tell you, because earlier I said it's one state already, I believe that in the not too distant future, that one state will become a battleground for equal rights. Because in the end, the Palestinians who are ruled by Israel currently, with no rights, will agitate for equal rights. And when that happens, there will be no more Jewish state, because they're in the demographic majority. That's what I foresee.
Thank you very much, Radha.